Around the world, in some of the most real estate-centric economies on the planet, house prices have been doing something they weren't supposed to be allowed to do. They are falling. Chinese real estate, once the single largest asset class in the world, has fallen consistently for the past 36 months straight. Canada is, so far, down by over 20% in certain cities. And even though I couldn't find it on a map to confirm, New Zealand's inflation-adjusted market is down by over a third in some of its major cities. The current real estate crash in these countries is, and/or was, arguably an even bigger deal than it is here in America, because somehow all of these examples have made real estate investing an even more central focus of their economy. Now, for the past 2 decades, the assumption has always been that governments would step in to stop house prices from falling too far before it turned into a full-blown economic crisis. And well, up until recently, government actions have kind of suggested that this would always be true. Even policies that were explicitly targeted at making housing affordable were actually just thinly disguised ways of making houses more expensive. But today, in many of these countries, it's starting to look like the party may be over, and the governments themselves are actively trying to shut it down. China has enacted strict financing regulations on property developers, Canada is loosening zoning and tightening migration, New Zealand has cut down on building restrictions all while their markets are already falling. And, well, it doesn't look like it is stopping with them either. Just this week, my personal favorite guinea pig economy, Australia, passed sweeping tax changes that undid a lot of the weird rules that made their real estate some of the most unaffordable on the planet. And of course, here at home, in the very same week, America just passed the, mostly bipartisan housing affordability package. A major bill that directly addresses a lot of the problems in the housing market that we have been yapping about on this channel for half a decade at this point. Now, I know you guys all like to make fun of me for being a gloomy goose, so let me just say, this is all really good news, especially for a lot of young people who have felt permanently priced out of owning a home. But it does all raise one important question. We have always been told that the housing market was too big to fail, and that significant price drops would undermine people's financial foundation, and potentially even cause a financial disaster. So what exactly has changed? And who is actually going to pay the price for this sudden reverse of course?
Sluggish economy, dripping house prices, struggling home sellers in China are facing a new challenge as banks step into the housing market.
The average price of a home in Canada went down again in April. It's the 17th monthly drop in a row.
Median home values dropped about 7% year over year in certain zip codes in the cities of Dallas, Salina, and Melissa.
They stopped making mortgage payments 2 years ago, soon after they lost their full-time jobs.
We have nowhere to go at all.
It came after President Trump abruptly canceled plans to sign a major housing bill.
We just passed something that we're all proud of. 85 votes in the Senate, 385 votes in the House to make housing more available to Americans.
Okay, so first and foremost, there is a big difference between an economic crisis causing falling home prices and falling home prices causing an economic crisis. At the very least, for a long time, nobody wanted to be the politician in charge to tell new buyers that they would be underwater on their mortgage, or boomers that their investment portfolio would fund slightly fewer cruise vacations. This inevitably led to a slew of housing policies across the world that only really tackled the demand side of the equation. First-time homebuyers couldn't break into the market, so we let them put 1% down, co-sign with their parents, access their retirement savings to use as a deposit, pay off their loan over 50 years, and in some extreme cases, even partner up with the government to qualify for a loan to buy a poorly constructed studio apartment. You know, the dream. Unsurprisingly, this only really let desperate people bid slightly more, raising the bar in a way that really only served the people who already owned properties exclusively as an investment. Now, you probably already knew all this, especially if you, well, you know, enjoy shelter. But, arguably, what we are seeing today is very different. Many countries have already seen house price drops larger than what they experienced in 2008, and policies seem to only be pushing that further. This is, unsurprisingly, sparking all manner of outcry from industry groups across the world, claiming that their respective governments are beating the poor real estate market while it's already down and ultimately lining us up for another major crisis. So, well, to see if those claims actually hold any merit, we need to do what the sensationalist headlines aren't willing to, and actually break down exactly what these new policies involve, and then we can look at what's happening in the few countries ahead of the curve to figure out what might be in store for us. So, starting with the biggest of these policy changes right here at home. The 21st Century Road to Housing Act just passed the House 358 to 32 and the Senate 85 to 5, making it one of the most overwhelmingly bipartisan pieces of legislation this Congress has produced. Now, as a bit of a political sideshow, as of the time of making this video, President Trump is currently refusing to sign the bill into law, reportedly because he wants to use it as leverage to push the Save America Act through first. Now, the good news is that politicians politicking doesn't really matter here, because with those margins, it has a veto-proof majority, so it will become law with or without a signature. The bad news is that, unfortunately, this political theater is distracting from some otherwise really significant and overwhelmingly positive balance changes to the current meta of the housing market. In particular, there are 3 standout features of this new piece of policy that are worth understanding. The first is that the bill offers incentives to local governments that loosen up zoning restrictions to allow for more homes to be built. Basically, the Department of Housing and Urban Development is going to be handing out grant money to any city that agrees to let developers build more densely and in more places. This is arguably the thing that housing economists have been begging for over the last decade. We already know that medium-density housing to smooth the transition between urban sprawl and high-density high-rises works because it's a big part of the reason why places like Houston, which has far laxer zoning restrictions, also has generally more affordable housing than comparable cities, even those within Texas. For years, federal housing policy basically pretended zoning was a local problem the feds conveniently couldn't touch. It simultaneously let Washington take credit for a strong housing market amongst their primarily home-owning voter base, while at the same time passed the buck of unaffordable housing onto city councils. So yeah, this bill is the first real acknowledgement that local zoning is indeed a national supply crisis. It sounds good, but it gets better. The second big component of this bill is a significant streamlining of the red tape around small homes, factory-built homes, and small factory-built homes. The biggest single change being the elimination of the permanent chassis requirement, which in the past meant that manufactured homes had to be built on a metal frame with wheels and axles even if nobody ever planned on moving them. Clearly, modern pre-manufactured homes have moved well beyond the trailers, and even though some factory home builders have found loopholes around this law, it's still a lot cheaper to not have anything to jump through in the first place. Eliminating this strange rule alone is expected to bring the cost of each manufactured home down by $5,000 to $7,000 according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development's own numbers. Now, in the grand scheme of modern housing, that may be a rounding error for most properties, but for entry-level housing, that may only cost $80,000 to $120,000 in the first place, which most prefabs tend to be. That is a pretty meaningful discount. The third big change is one that I hope sounds familiar to a lot of you. It heavily restricts investment firms from buying single-family homes. Any corporate investor that already owns 350 or more houses is now banned from purchasing additional ones. This should eliminate what has been a major competitor to regular families while theoretically pushing that capital towards better alternatives like multifamily developments that boost overall supply. Now, for what little it's worth, these are all changes that I have been personally advocating for almost 5 years now on this channel. As a bit of a personal side note, I do hope in whatever small way I can, these videos have helped make these ideas slightly more popular to the point where we are actually seeing real change. But as a lot of people, mostly those with vested interests, have been quick to point out, house prices in a lot of these areas are already falling. And these policies could accelerate that trend to the point where it seriously undermines the finances of a lot of everyday people. And well, you know what? They kind of have a point. Just perhaps not in the way they were expecting. The American housing market is really dozens of different market regions all behaving somewhat independent of one another. And while some markets have remained strong around certain cities, a lot of the country is already seeing pretty significant drops in housing prices. As of May, national list prices were down 2.4% year over year, with prices falling in 41 of the top 50 metro areas and drops recorded across all 4 major consensus regions. The biggest declines were along the West Coast and the Sun Belt, where there is still a glut of new homes left over from the pandemic-era construction boom. And there are some pretty clear reasons why this is happening even before the new laws take effect. The first is interest rates. Mortgage rates have effectively tripled from where they were when housing peaked, meaning that by simple arithmetic, people just cannot borrow as much as they could a few years ago with the same income. The second is that internal migration patterns have shifted. People are still moving out of the pandemic boom cities back towards the few centers with job opportunities. Now again, I have been yapping about this for 3 years now, so it's probably not exactly shocking to any of you watching anymore. But the third and probably the most underappreciated variable is insurance costs, which have become a major deal killer, especially in certain regions of the Sun Belt. To buy a house with a mortgage, you need to hold home insurance, and there are now a lot of parts of the country that have become borderline uninsurable. In Florida, the average annual home insurance premium hit $8,292 last year, up 18% in a single year. In Houston, homeowners are paying almost $8,000 a year. These get counted against people's ability to repay their mortgage and applications, because $8,000 going to an insurance company is $8,000 that a household won't have to make mortgage repayments. A growing chunk of homeowners who can't get coverage through traditional insurance are also being pushed into the surplus lines market, where premiums are even higher and consumer protections are weaker. That market went from handling about 2% of home policies to roughly 16% in states like Florida and Texas in just 3 years. At those prices, even if someone can afford the mortgage, they might not be able to afford to insure the house, making it effectively unsellable to everybody outside of cash buyers who are willing to live in an uninsurable home. On top of all of this, those very same investment firms that have bought up all of those single-family homes over the last decade were kind of heading for the exit even before this law was passed, trying to get out ahead of what they clearly see as an incoming market correction. Large institutional investors are now net sellers of single-family rental homes. In Dallas, for example, investors own about 9% of the housing stock, but are responsible for almost 23% of all new for-sale listings. So yeah, even before this law goes into effect, the housing market has got rates keeping buyers sidelined, insurance making entire regions unaffordable, and the biggest institutional buyers dumping inventory. The drops aren't catastrophic yet, and almost everywhere is still up compared to before COVID. But if these new laws really do deliver the supply they are promising on top of everything that is already pushing prices down, it's worth at least asking what happens if we push things too far in the other direction. Potentially, this could kind of be like when your insufferable coworkers insist on turning the office into a sauna during the summer, and then finally lamenting and turning on the AC, right as we were already heading into winter. I mean, it's great that they came around, but this would have probably been a lot better to do a few months ago. So it's time to learn how Money works to find out if this is the right policy just at the wrong time, and if falling house prices really are an economic crisis. Most people have no idea how much of their personal information is already out there. Hundreds of data brokers are collecting and selling your data right now, and they don't need your permission to do it. That's why this video is sponsored by Incogni. Your email address, phone number, home address, and more are probably sitting on data broker websites right now, ready for scammers and identity thieves to buy. And it's not your fault. It's mostly because the companies you trusted with your data aren't careful enough with it. Incogni automatically contacts these data brokers on your behalf and demands they remove your information. They handle the back and forth, the follow-ups, and the legal requests so you don't have to. And with their new custom removals feature, they can even go after specific instances of your info being leaked online. Just Google yourself and you might be surprised to find that news sites, fitness apps, or random websites you've never heard of are holding and sharing your personal details. With custom removals, you just submit the link and Incogni's privacy experts will handle the rest. The way I see it, they can't steal your identity if they have no idea who you are. Go to incogni.com/howmanyworks or use code HowManyWorks at the link below to get 60% off an annual plan and take your personal data back. Okay, so again, there's a big difference between a crisis causing falling prices and falling prices causing a crisis. It's also just possible for house prices to fall. If a regular good or service becomes cheaper, that is usually an optimal economic outcome. So well, what kind of situation are we really looking at? NPR's Planet Money published a really good breakdown of this exact question last week, and we will leave a link to it in the description. But to steal their homework a bit, the key distinction comes down to why prices are falling. If prices drop because more housing is being built and supply is catching up to demand, that is a healthy market doing exactly what markets are supposed to do. Denver right now is a decent example of this. Home prices are down over 2% year over year. Rents have dropped even further, and renters in the city are understandably celebrating. One 29-year-old medical resident who NPR interviewed just moved into a bigger apartment with bigger amenities that he previously couldn't afford but can now because rents have come down. His friend renegotiated her lease for $500 less a month just by showing her landlord what comparable units were listing for. The underlying economy in Denver is still growing. People still want to live there. Land values are stable. The city just actually built enough housing to give buyers and renters some options, and in doing so, also gave employment opportunity to tradespeople who were doing the building. That is, in theory, the good kind of price decline. It sounds great, but then of course, there will be people pointing to counterexamples like Detroit. After decades of deindustrialization, the city lost nearly a third of its population between 1990 and 2010. Home prices fell by over 80%, and at one point in 2007, houses were literally cheaper than cars. It was a pretty grim situation that was made even worse by the global financial crisis, which again was a crisis causing a decline in prices. Even still, nobody was celebrating affordable housing in Detroit. That was an economy collapsing and dragging real estate down with it. And to be clear, throughout modern history, there have been dozens of regional housing corrections that went basically unnoticed by the broader economy. 2008 was the exception, not the rule. So if we were just building more houses and making shelter more affordable, that should be a good thing. Even for people who already own their own homes outright, broadly higher house prices on a day-to-day basis really mean higher property taxes and higher insurance premiums anyway. If they sell, they still need to buy somewhere else to live. So lower prices across the board actually reduces their ongoing expenses without drastically impacting their realizable wealth. The fear-mongering around 2008 should be understood in its proper context here. That crisis was caused by severe structural problems in the financial industry that just happened to be using housing as a convenient conduit for reckless speculation. The housing market was fragile, yes, but it was collateral damage to the real underlying problem, which was that Wall Street had been bundling garbage mortgages into securities, stamping them AAA, and spreading those losses across the entire global financial system. So the widespread FUD from groups who simply don't want the value of their assets to be undermined is, to put it generously, a bit disingenuous. One additional factor, for what it's worth, is that even for people who do view housing purely as an investment, they have to recognize that their investment returns have largely been propped up by very accommodating government policies that protected the housing market over the last 2 decades. So it should stand to reason that a private investment that benefited from government support would also be exposed to the risk of government intervention too. However, there are still genuine risks here. Falling house prices become an actual economic problem when people are over-leveraged in housing, when the financial system is using it as collateral, and when other sectors of the economy are dependent on housing values continuing to go up. And well, we kind of tick all 3 of those boxes at the moment, which brings us to the much less comfortable question of who actually ends up paying for this. If the music really does slow down, someone is going to end up in a bad position. And overwhelmingly right now, that is people who have only just purchased their homes with minimal equity. If you have bought a house in the last 2 or 3 years, especially after 2002 when rates were already elevated, you might be sitting on a mortgage at 6+% with very little buffer between what you owe and what the house is currently worth. A 10 or 15% drop from here and you're underwater, owing more than the house could sell for. Now, with a bit of critical thinking, we can probably see that this might have been a lot less painful if we hadn't spent the last decade trying to get as many people into a home as possible with 1% deposits and effectively zero safety buffer. But c'est la vie. What's more is that even if we did end up seeing price declines similar to somewhere like New Zealand's major cities, which we probably won't for reasons we will get into soon, that is still only going to put us back to where we were in 2021. So we are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place where prices are allowed to grow so much that anything short of a catastrophic drop still won't actually make homes affordable. Now, there is some tragic irony in all of this. Young people who have just purchased a home stand to be hurt by this significantly more than older homeowners who statistically have more equity if not a fully paid off house. But young people are still by far the most supportive demographic of these policy changes. Now, to play devil's advocate a bit, there is one growing sector of the economy that may be hurt by this market correction more than most people are realizing, and that is aged care. Over the last 2 decades in particular, this industry has grown up around effectively harvesting the equity from people's homes to fund slightly more comfortable end-of-life care. Reverse mortgages, cash-out refinancing, or just selling the family house outright to pay for a spot in a facility. There are a lot of old people as the baby boomers enter the twilight years, and things like aged care facilities have become incredibly expensive because, well, they could. Residents have been showing up with houses that doubled or tripled in value over the last 20 years, so the facilities raised their rates to match their increased spending power. A lot of these facilities are heavily leveraged themselves as very common targets for private equity leveraged buyouts. They have historically been able to borrow against the assumption that a steady stream of homeowners would keep showing up ready to sell their house for 6 or 7 figures to fund their stay. Now, nobody is going to shed many tears if this particular industry gets starved of its easy money from home equity. But it's also worth realizing that for a lot of smaller communities, aged care has been one of the more stable sources of employment for a very long time. More broadly, it would also be irresponsible to not at least mention the wealth effect of number going up and the consumer pessimism that comes from number going down. A lot of people are spending based on the fact that they have a fully paid off house that has doubled in value in the last 5 years, sometimes even with the help of a cash-out refinance, which has always ended super well. It is irrational, but when the number on Zillow drops by 15%, the instinct to tighten the belt follows pretty quickly. A stock portfolio dropping is one thing, But for a lot of American households, their house is their primary wealth. And unlike stocks, you can't sell 10% of your house to cover expenses. Now, to be fair, most economists who have weighed in on this are not predicting a 2008-style collapse from any of these policy changes. Lending standards, despite our best attempts, are still significantly better than they were back then. The securitization risk is lower, and the underlying demand for housing in this country is still very real. Now, all in all, this might all sound pretty good, but it gets better, because there are already other countries ahead of us in this process that we have had the luxury of watching from the sidelines. Chinese real estate was once the single largest asset class on the planet, and since the government introduced the 3 red lines policy to crack down on excessively borrowing by property developers in 2020, prices have been falling more or less consistently for a half-decade at this point. In the first quarter of this year alone, residential sales fell 13.1% by area and 18.5% by value compared to the same period last year. Evergrande, once the country's biggest developer, delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, making its shares worthless. Hundreds of development projects across the country were left half-finished, with deposits already collected from families who will probably never see these homes completed. Despite a very major disruption to the core asset class of their household wealth, the Chinese economy is once again growing, only this time being fueled by more sustainable industries like high-end manufacturing and exports rather than building and trading empty houses back and forth to one another. This is despite other headwinds like poor demographics, weak consumer confidence, and the ongoing tech crackdown in addition to their housing crash. So yeah, if China had a housing market that was arguably even more important to their economy, crashed more severely, and was experienced alongside other headwinds, and they have largely kept on chugging, and if anything, realigned their economy into more sustainable, productive industries. It's not been a painless experience, but it also wasn't the global financial crisis. My good friend Yuri from Money and Macro made a video on this as I was putting this one together, so I will leave a link to his work in the video description below. New Zealand is another one worth watching. After years of being one of the most overheated housing markets on the planet, the government cut building restrictions, raised interest rates and adjusted tax concessions, and inflation-adjusted prices in some major cities dropped by over a third from their peak. They've pushed through even more reforms since, including a law that lets homeowners build granny flats in their backyards without any building consents at all. Housing inventory is now at a 10-year high, and it's very much a buyer's market. Canada is also worth considering because we are obviously very close geographically, culturally, and economically, and their housing market has also kind of been going through it. Condo prices are down about 6.6% year over year nationally, and the situation in Toronto and Vancouver is particularly rough. In the first quarter of this year, there were over 4,200 new completed condos sitting unsold in the Greater Toronto area alone, a record high. Vancouver has a similar glut with unsold inventory up 76% from a year ago. And in the interest of fairness, there has been pain, and Canadian policymakers are starting to get some cold feet. Prime Minister Carney recently announced a $1.5 billion program to buy up unsold Vancouver condos and convert them into rent-to-own affordable housing, which a lot of people are, probably correctly, just seeing as a developer bailout sold to the general public as an affordable housing program. The government says the developers won't turn a profit on these sales, which is something, but they also won't be exposed to the catastrophic loss they would have endured had the government not been there to socialize their losses. And then there is Australia, potentially the most cooked housing market on the planet. They're phasing out negative gearing on established property starting next year, which was the tax loophole that let property investors write off rental losses against their salary income. We always talk about housing as an investment conflicting with housing as shelter. But negative gearing in Australia meant that houses were neither shelter nor assets so much as they were tax-advantaged financial instruments. But anyway, they are joining these other countries with significant housing reforms, and they're additionally overhauling the capital gains tax discount to significantly reduce the incentive to treat housing purely as a speculative investment. These were once the supply side and investor deterrent policies that were once considered untouchable in Australian politics. Now it's worth noting that outside of China, all of these countries had economies that were already slowing before their housing corrections really kicked in, making it genuinely difficult to separate cause from effect. And again, this is all happening in a market with a lot of other stuff going on at the moment. So go and watch this video next to find out where the housing market was before we doubled down. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.